It's a huge leap going from Silent Hill to Her Story. So the first thing, and you have spoken about this more or less, talking about the Isle as interactive fiction and the genre and the origins as something kind of an experiment going back to Infocom and these video games of the 80s. But your games, after Silent Hill Shattered Memories, have been often described as interactive fictions. So do you think that's a video game genre? Is it something that has evolved from this original genre? Do you think it's something closer to interactive films? I mean, the matter of genre in video games today is quite vague, and interactive fiction maybe doesn't mean the same thing today as it meant in the 80s. So what do you think about your games in terms of genre?
Yeah, and a genre is weird. Steam just pushed this idea that they're going to help people discover things by genre more, right? So with our current project, we were looking at the store and we're like, okay, well, which genre are we ticking? And none of them really fit. And you have this weird thing. So we were looking at it, and horror was not a genre. Horror was a theme. And the genre might be adventure game or point and click or first person shooter or whatever. So it's very difficult. I mean, not to jump back to Silent Hill straight away, but the thing that was a big point for me when making Shattered Memories was the way that video games work. You had then the survival horror genre, which was defining these types of stories by game mechanics. So you trace that back to there was the original game Alone in the Dark in France, which was very innovative and was inspired by Lovecraft. So it took place in an old mansion. The character would read a lot of diary entries and notebooks because that's Lovecraft, right? That's the genre in this kind of Victorian kind of cosmic horror. Then along comes Capcom, and they make Resident Evil, and they take a lot of the game mechanics from Alone in the Dark, and then they add in a bit of George A. Romero's zombie stuff. So they add in the fact that combat is desperate and survival based. You are scavenging ammo, and it's these zombies are easy enough if there's one of them, but if there are lots of them, you'll get crowded and killed. And it creates this weird fusion of the Lovecraftian stuff with the George A. Romero stuff. So I'm still reading lots of diaries and weird puzzles. There's all these strange arcane puzzles, which fits if you're in the mansion of an ancient necromancer, is weirder when you're in a police station. But then that essentially becomes fixed. That is how every horror game has to play. So you end up with Silent Hill, where the inspirations from outside games are things like Jacob's Ladder, right? It's psychological horror, all these stories that take place in the imagination of the protagonist. But in Silent Hill, I'm still shooting people in the head with a shotgun, smashing them with a pipe, and scavenging for supplies and health kits. And that was this frustration for me, was when we think of story genres outside of games, that categorization can sometimes make more sense, because you're talking about, well, what is the protagonist? What is their relationship to the world and the problem? What is the tone of this thing? But that had become kind of conflated with game mechanics in a way that was kind of weird. And it is a problem commercially, because, genre is a useful tool to help you sell your story to somebody. I like reading psychological horror novels, so I can go into a bookstore and find my next book, right? It also tells the audience what to expect from their story, so that they're not disappointed, that you can play with that. So it was always a frustration for me working within commercial games that you were very limited to what you could do mechanically, and what you could do story-wise, and that these were very rigid. And there were going to be 10 genres. that you had to pick from, and that was it. Like, so you were kind of very limited. So really, her story came partly out of wanting to break away from that, about looking at genre, and I had this strong belief that the kind of detective story, the mystery story, the police procedural story was like an evergreen genre outside of games. You know, if you have a TV channel, you will need a cop show. If you are a book publisher, you're going to have some crime novels. But we hadn't done a great job in games of addressing that audience. And I would pitch it to publishers, and they would always tell me, yeah, it's big elsewhere, but it's not going to work in games. And I think that's to some extent because that is a genre that is driven by character. There's lots of dialogue and character interaction. There is a complexity to the story that kind of goes beyond just cause and effect and action, right? So when I went to make her story, I thought for a while, and the setup for her story was I knew that I had enough money to work for a year making a game. And at this point, you mentioned Legacy of Kain. So this was, I worked on Legacy of Kain for 3 years after Silent Hill, which was this big, ambitious, AAA game. There was this struggle. We were trying to do interesting things with narrative. At the same time, it was an expensive AAA game. So we had to have cool combat, and we had to have collectibles and side quests and all these things. But after 3 years, when that was cancelled, after having realized with Shattered Memories, this is what I want to do. I want to make these cool character-driven video games. I suddenly looked around and saw that these things had died a bit. BioShock had been this high point in terms of the acceptance within the industry that, like, oh, we can give Ken Levine lots of money to go and make this game that has capital T themes, and it's a single play game, and it tells a story, and that's it. That's the whole experience. And it felt like, oh, this is cool. Like, I loved making Shattered Memories. I was working on Legacy of Kain. Those games existed. It felt like if we continue to make these games and they are popular, that's the course that I would like to chart. But when Legacy of Kain was cancelled in like 2013, 2014, I kind of looked around, and outside of Naughty Dog making a game, one game at a time, outside of David Cage at that point being given lots of money by Sony to make things, maybe Ubisoft, although their games are so sprawling, like no one was making this kind of game, the prestige story game. So that led me to think, well, I'm going to go and try this indie world out. But I knew that I wanted to do something interesting. And I felt that if this was possibly my only chance to make an indie game, like if this didn't succeed, I would go back to my normal job. I should try and do everything that I wanted to do in one go. So I was like, right, I'm going to prove that detective stories are a cool thing. I am going to, at this point I'd had this realization. So like growing up, I was obsessed with the immersive sims, games like Ultima Underworld, Thief, then Deus Ex, System Shock. And that kind of tied into this general idea that the ultimate video game is going to be this 3D immersive virtual reality, right? Where I will step into the shoes of my character and the world and the story will just happen all around me. But having kind of then made a bunch of games, certainly like Shattered Memories to some extent was a love letter to that immersion in a 3D world. I started to question how important that stuff was. Because I knew that as a storyteller, working at great speed on Origins, say, I knew that we would create an hour of gameplay in this cool space. We'll create an abandoned an abandoned theater, and there'll be some puzzles and some enemies, and that'll last you an hour. And then I would write down my 10 little bits of story, and I'd put them on notes or have little cutscenes, and I'd sprinkle them around. And it's a fun way to discover a story. But I was questioning, where is the story actually being delivered? And there were games like Gone Home, and I kind of interrogated, like, Gone Home has the fun of exploring an environment from BioShock. It gets rid of all this the fighting and the silly gameplay. But when I kind of asked myself, what is driving the emotion? For me, it was the voice acting. And there was a good anecdote. I think Steve Gaynor, at some point said their original plan for that game was it be totally realistic. Like, you were uncovering a story just by going through this house, looking at objects, seeing the detritus left by these people's lives. And at some point, it wasn't working. Like, people were not feeling what they wanted them to feel. And that's when he had this idea that when you read these diary pages, you would hear the voice in your head of the character, even though it makes no sense, right, within the narrative. And I was really thinking, like, the thing that made me feel emotions in Gone Home was listening to that character's voice. And yes, it was cool to walk around the world and do these things, but if I had heard a radio play that was the messages from Gone Home, would it have been that different? And so really, her story, I wanted to test all these ideas. So for her story, I said, well, I'm going to go make a detective game. I'm going to make a game with no 3D exploration, no embodiment of a protagonist, no cause. This was a key one. No cause and effect. So I think, especially when we talk about interactive fiction, there's especially when you talk about genre, there's a general expectation that interactive fiction, which sometimes people will call choose your own adventure, is about cause and effect, that the interactive part of the narrative is the branching. That's why it's different from a normal story, is that in an interactive story, you make choices, and that systemic thing, the cause and effect, is what makes the interactivity part of the story. And I didn't necessarily believe that. And I was starting to question that, because I thought there was a lot that happens with interactivity. There's a lot that we're doing just by interfacing with a computer that isn't about this systemic aspect. So I think with her story, I said, I'm going to make a detective game, and there'll be no 3D exploration. There'll be no, I think I've maybe said something like, there's no variables. There's no state, no meaningful state change. Because really, in her story, all of the things happen in your head. They're not necessarily happening in the system of the game. And the other thing I said was, I wanted to make a game about subtext, which came out of Legacy of Kain, where I would argue with the producer at Square Enix, because I would write the scripts, and I was working with a very cool writer on the script, and we would show them the pages, and this one producer would he would read them, and he'd be like, I don't get it. In this scene, why doesn't the character just say what they're thinking? Like, why doesn't he just come out and say it? Why do they have to have it? And I was like, well, that would be bad writing. I was like, you can't have him say, I love you, or I hate you, whatever. Like, you if you give that line to an actor, it will sound phony. You need to put it in the subtext. That's what writing and acting is about. And we'd argue about this for a bit, and then they would say, well, okay, that might be true in movie and TV because you have a human face that can express all of this. But in video games, where we only have motion capture, maybe it's not possible. And the disagreement was, I felt, we should at least try, because otherwise we would just write in crap writing. And so coming out of all those arguments, I was like, I want to prove that the interesting narrative is in the subtext. And so many video games, and again, this was true in Legacy of Kain, because we were trying to make this big budget game. There's kind of a user experience aspect, which sometimes is meshed with story. So if the story is your reason for doing stuff, if your story is your goal or your objective as a player, people would get worried because they want to make sure the objective is very clear. Like, you don't want players to be confused about what they're supposed to be doing. You don't want them to be confused about why they're doing it. So, you know, in a game, someone will stand up and say, I'm going to cross the mountain to kill the dragon. Like, and that's what's happening, and that's the story. Whereas, you know, you might not necessarily want the character to be as aware of or as tied to, or, you know, the actual goals that their character has. So I really wanted to dig into that. So I had all these things that I wanted to juggle, and that became her story, and it kind of came out of a process where a big thing I wanted to do differently as well. So I wanted to do all these things with the game itself, but also the process. The process on Legacy of Kain had been painful. If you are the director and writer of a big budget video game like that, the process is that you maybe have written, I think at that point I'd written like a 10-page document saying, here's my idea for the game and what's cool about it. And as an independent developer, you know, we weren't going to spend a year making a game, you know, before the publisher paid us for it. So then Square Enix greenlights the game, says, we'll go make this idea. And immediately the team ramps up. So immediately you have a team of animators creating animations. You have concept artists creating all the characters in this world. You have level designers building levels, puzzles, all this stuff. And you haven't written the story yet. So the process of writing that was, you know, writing as we were making stuff up, trying desperately to keep all these different teams together so that the combat team understood, why is this character fighting? How is this character fighting? The level design team knew why this level existed, how it was going to relate to all these other things. So it's like a very messy, and, you know, you hear stories about, I think going back to Ken Levine again, I think it was like BioShock Infinite. They built a whole like fifth of the world, and he got to a point where it's like, actually, that doesn't make sense anymore. Like, that's all wrong. So they just threw it out because you're drafting this. So I had some jealousy towards, and I know it's not like this all the time, or maybe even most of the time, but the notion of a screenwriter going away. And, you know, in the ideal world, you have this single author or team of authors thinking through the whole idea of a movie on paper, where it's less expensive and where you can kind of try stuff out and you can rip pages out, move things around until you arrive at a screenplay that you can give to someone and they look at it and go, actually, this is a damn good movie. And then you have the process where a director comes in and a team, and they have this blueprint for the movie that everyone's working off of. And I liked that idea of upfront people just thinking on paper. And there's a, I'm going to call it an excuse, but there's a thing people say in video games a lot of the time, which is that until you actually start making the game, you don't know what it is you're making. And so people will often kind of play down the, you know, you couldn't in theory design a whole game on paper and then it would just work. But I think sometimes, because it's hard to prove something on paper, I think sometimes is an excuse, because it's easier to just say, well, we'll figure it out when we build this thing. We'll iterate and we'll do sprints or whatever. But I felt that I really liked the scrutiny. You know, if you read a script for a movie and it sucks, you can say it sucks. if there's a problem with the end of Act 2, there's a problem with the end of Act 2 on paper, and you can give it back to the writer and say, you got to fix it. Like the story doesn't make sense. So with her story, part of it was, and although I only had a year, of that year, I said, well, 6 months, I'm not going to build anything. For 6 months, I'm going to just figure this thing out on paper, what it is. So there was a lot of, when I knew what kind of game I wanted to make, I went and read all the manuals and did all the training for homicide detectives for how one should conduct an interview. I went and read all the academic texts about what happens in that room. I went and watched all the movies that are about police interrogations. I discovered at that point, slightly ahead of like the true crime renaissance, but you were starting to see like on YouTube clips of real interrogations, kind of dug into all those. Did a lot of just absorbing and researching, and that kind of then came together as the specific ideas of her story. So that was, not only was I trying to make something that was a bit different to the rigid genres that existed, but I was also trying to develop the game in a slightly different way that, again, was kind of more freeing.
So thank you very much for your answer, because you've covered like very different things we wanted to ask you. So we are just going to pick some of the things you've been saying because they are really interesting to us. One of the things you said is that when you work the detective fiction and detective genre, the player must make his way through videos and discover what has happened, but in a game, there's normally an objective and a way to win or to finish the game. But maybe, do you think that in your games is solving the mystery the main objective? Because maybe it's your open-ended games are not.
Yeah, I think
not a clear way to win or to lose in your games.
Yeah, I was very conscious of this. In making her story. Again, like a lot of this came out of arguments I had on Legacy of Kain. We had this opening to Legacy of Kain that I modeled after Hitchcock's The Birds that took about 30, 45 minutes. But the idea was going into that game, I knew that at the end of the process, if that game would ever come out, there would be trailers and box art of this cool, badass main character with claws, like fighting people and it being awesome. And so the idea was the audience coming in expecting that. I wanted to use that and play with it. And I was very conscious because we were being asked to put a lot of fighting in this game. And like, I'm not hugely into lots of fighting in games. In terms of the ideas I have. So I really wanted to justify this. And one of the things I was very fixated on was there's a wrong idea that people think that human beings are naturally violent, so they just love fighting games. And that if you just give them a cool character and the chance to fight lots of enemies, that will inherently be fun. And what I pointed out was that the desire that they're referencing there, it doesn't just exist. We have a desire to overcome obstacles and challenges to us, so that if something opposes us, we have this natural desire that rises up to overcome it, and that's where that comes from. So it was very important to me in Legacy of Kain that we justify the when you fight things, there was a reason you were doing it, and that we would build up in you the urge to overcome this obstacle, and that emotionally we bed you in. And so we set it up where you started the game as this somewhat pathetic atheist priest who is in this world, this weird vampire human world where for reasons we'd invented, the human race had become infertile and was kind of living out this shitty existence in these kind of backwaters. And your character was a coward who had become a priest as a way of avoiding being drafted into the vampire wars and dying. The start of the game, his wife has become pregnant, which is seen as this huge miraculous sign because no one has had a baby in this village for years. But he's an atheist, and he hates the priesthood because it represents his cowardice. And so the start of the game, you're expecting to play as this badass killing machine, and you get dropped in and you're walking around as this guy who's being a bit of a shit to everyone in his village, who's trying to celebrate things. And we kind of make you live in his shoes for a bit. And then we make you sit through a play. We had this medieval mystery play that he watched, and he doesn't want to sit through it. And so we were building and building all these frustrations. And we were trying to give the audience this desire that they knew at some point the badass vampire was going to show up and kill everybody, and they would get to then actually have fun and do all these things. And then when the badass vampire turned up and killed everybody, it was actually really sad. And suddenly the player now is going to feel guilty about having willed that into existence. And that's going to kind of fuel it. And I say we were modeling this after kind of what Hitchcock did in The Birds. So I had all these arguments about, and of course, that was something we were told, yes, this is Legacy of Kain. It's a very clever, cerebral thing. Do all this cool stuff you want to do, Sam. This sounds great. And at some point, the higher up executives looked at it and they're like, so I can't fight for 30 minutes? And like we had stuff in there, like the first fight was beautiful. The first time you got to fight, the village had been slaughtered. Your guy who's pissed, he's wandered off in the middle of this play because it's doing his head in, comes back to find everyone dead. And the killer is there, and he picks up a sword from one of the actors, so it's a play sword, and starts trying to fight this spectral vampire assassin. And so you're pressing all the combat buttons, and the camera is in a video game combat place, but your character is appallingly bad and just gets toyed with by this vampire who then kills him. And so the execs were like, why are you fucking with the player? Like, why are you trying to make it not fun? And we were like, because we're building this up, and at 45 minutes, they'll actually get to fight, and then it will mean something, and this will come from a true place, and it'll be interesting. And the second time you got to fight, it's a very complicated story, but at some point, your character gets killed, and his soul is consumed by this vampire assassin thing. But for some reason, that is the core mystery of that game, he takes over the body of his murderer. So you now have this atheist priest in the body of this vampire killing machine. And his initial instinct is, well, I'm going to kill you. Like, I'm going to have my revenge on you. But he's such a coward, he can't bring himself to kill this vampire whose body he's possessing. So they go, at some point, he's now being emotionally bullied by this vampire who's still kind of hanging around in his head. They wander off, and there's a group of horrible human mercenaries who see what to them looks like a deranged vampire talking to himself. So they turn up and they're like, oh, we can have some fun killing this thing. At which point your character is like, oh, brilliant. They're going to kill me. I'm too, I can't bring myself to do it myself, but I'm going to let them kill me. So again, it goes into combat mode. But every time you press a fighting button, your character is like, kill me, come on. And so for the second time, we do not let you have any video game combat. And finally, when you got to have it, like the idea was it would mean something. And it was that weird thing, that again comes from that era of like BioShock. And I felt like it was a little bit, we were selling out a little bit in the, if it's a given that you have to have lots of combat in your game, then you naturally try and figure out, how do we make this interesting or clever? How do we comment on the violence? And so at some point you end up in doing a BioShock or a Spec Ops or something where you're trying to have your cake and eat it. You're like, yeah, you get to have loads of fun violence, but then at some point go, but should you have been enjoying that? So it's a little bit, feels a little bit silly. But yeah, so we've had all these debates about like, what is the player's desire? Like, are you frustrating their desires? How how much should you be pandering to the player? How much should you be I mean, especially with that game, the marketing people kept telling us this should be aspirational. This character should be wish fulfillment for teenage boys. Would a teenage boy want to do this? Would a teenage boy want to be this character? Was always like, was constantly the reference for everything. So with her story, I strongly felt that that players are clever and that they are intelligent, especially as a mass. And this core idea of her story was, if I give them something that doesn't welcome them, that is opaque to some extent. So her story opens on the most boring thing you can imagine: a Windows 3.1 desktop with some database software, and that's it. It doesn't tell you what you're doing there. It doesn't have objectives and goals. It doesn't lead you through the narrative. My belief was that is so provocative, as it's like the monolith in 2001. It's like it's just there. It's willing you to crack it. It's like, come on, figure this thing out. And I really felt that, especially in interactive things, you can be more provocative and you can actually ask more of your audience because they're engaged, they're leaning in. So really, yeah, her story came out of this idea that if you give them something that feels slightly unknowable, that as a human beings have these incredible brains, and we're obsessed with pattern recognition. We're obsessed with creating order. The whole purpose of the imagination is a survival instinct. Came out of if I'm wandering the plains as a furry primitive human, and I see a rock bounces down off a cliff. Was it the wind that just blew that off, or is there a mountain lion up there, right? And my imagination imagines now that there's a lion there, and I get scared and I run away. And if there was a lion, I just saved my life. Even if there wasn't, it works out. So you have this whole, whenever we tell stories, we're screwing with that framework. So I had this strong belief that you could give people something that didn't have that shape, that didn't lead them, and it would naturally be interesting. It would inspire their curiosity, and that if you made it more free, that would be even more interesting to them. If you took down the barriers to them just losing themselves in this thing, that desire to bring order to this big mess would kind of spring out. And I think that kind of bore out. But I think the thing that I was very interested in after her story came out, I guess I guess I knew this, but definitely I was interested in it afterwards, was that the murder mystery, the idea that you need to solve this crime, was kind of the hook that got people in. They're like, oh, cool, I get to be a detective. Oh, I'm going to solve this crime. Like, did somebody murder their husband? What's going on? But you can solve that question to a degree quite easily or quite quickly, which then leads to the more interesting objective, which for me is understanding this woman. It's like learning her history, learning her story. And again, like I said with Isle, like it kind of mirrored my journey in that, from the start going, well, I'm going to make a detective game. Some point, you're going to be a detective in an interrogation room. But then, particularly when I started watching those videos of the interrogations of the real people, there was one particular story, the Jodi Arias case in the US, who is this woman who murdered her boyfriend quite violently. They were both Mormons. She was quite beautiful, and there was a lot of sex involved. So it was this huge public, and people loved this story. And the way in which her character was set up according to story cliches was quite interesting to me. She was pitched as the femme fatale. She was this sexy ice maiden who had murdered this guy. But to actually then, and they had hours of her interrogation online that was released to the public. So I sat and watched this thing for like a week, just all these hours of footage. By the end of it, like, I was on her side. Like, my empathy was totally with her, because that situation of the interrogation room, you have somebody that has murdered somebody. So that's probably the worst thing they've ever done in their lives. And the reason they've done it is usually tied up in the whole rest of their life. And usually they have not ever had a chance to talk any of this through with people. If there is some bad shit that has happened in their life, this has all been kept inside of them. So you have the homicide detective who's like, I'm just here, I'm your friend, just, I want to hear your side of the story. And all this stuff comes out. So spending a week watching those interviews with Jodie, like, by the end of it, yeah, it was no longer like the fantasy of being a detective. I was much more interested in, wow, I've really got to know this person and have this empathy for this person. And that was the interesting part. It wasn't, the question of did this person do it is your A plot, right, in a movie. Once you got to the B plot of like, well, why did Jodie do this? Why did she kill her boyfriend? Why did she end up in this relationship? That was far more interesting. So, similar to Isle, like the way it developed organically was that the meta structure of the game kind of mirrored the development structure. But yeah, I think for me, the extent to which you get people in with that hook and the mystery, but then at some point your just natural curiosity comes out. And I think this for me is kind of the nugget that I'm still playing with of what kind of interactive story am I telling? You always have that debate, which is a slightly pointless debate of like, what's more important, plot or character, right? And plot is important in a fixed narrative. In a movie where I'm sat for 90 minutes and you need to keep my attention on the screen and you need to keep me following it all the way through. So plot is important because it gives a direction to the narrative. It gives me a reason to keep watching what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next. But when you're divorced from that fixed narrative, when it's actually my curiosity that is not only justifying me being there, but driving what I'm doing, you become slightly more divorced from plot. And I think you can start to embrace character and this broader concept of what a narrative might look like. So that's kind of, having done that in her story, which is as well, if you're okay with me still answering this question, part of that in her story came out of going deep on the idea of a detective story and looking at the history of the detective story. And this was kind of justifying my belief that the audience was intelligent, was looking at the history of popular storytelling and seeing that the origins of the detective story, so the Agatha Christie stuff, very much, these are like puzzle box narratives, right? And you have a detective who isn't really a character. It's like a collection of mannerisms, but the detective is just this character that walks around in order to help you solve the puzzle. And usually with those narratives, at the very end, the puzzle is explained by the detective. And these were very popular. At some point, the audience has seen every trick that you can play within that framework, and the genre evolves. So you go from the whodunit to the howdunit, right? Which is like Columbo. The TV show Columbo is a great example where the start of an episode of Columbo, they show you who did it. So that's out the way. And then in comes Columbo, and now you have this incredible dramatic irony where you know who did it, Columbo doesn't. So you're watching the murderer, seeing how are they dealing with the stress. you're seeing Columbo. Is he going to figure it out? You're still trying to figure out, well, how did the murderer hide the body, or how did they what have they done to cover their tracks? But it's a much more sophisticated piece of storytelling for the audience. But because the audience knows the tropes, knows all these different ideas from the Agatha Christie stuff, they bring that information with them. So you can have something that is more complicated. And then you kind of get to the more recent stuff, the why done it, right? So you have this audience that's now seen all the Columbos. They've seen every episode of Diagnosis Murder and whatever else, all the cop shows. And the why done it, and I think like some of the Scandinavian stuff is a great example of this. The why done it is like, we don't really care about the mystery and the puzzle. But we're really interested in exploring the psychology of this character. It might be like there's a British TV show, Cracker, where the main character was not a detective, he was a psychiatrist. So the best bits of that where he would sit in a room opposite the suspect and just get in their brains. Like serial killer movies are often in this genre because it's more about exploring this character that's ended up being so strange or interesting. Sometimes, like I think True Detective is a good example, where the character we care about in True Detective is the two detectives. Like their story is the interesting one. They're the characters whose layers we peel back. The fact that I think in that show, like at the very end, they're like, oh yeah, the gardener did it. I mean, like no one cares. It's the fact that you've realized at the start you thought Woody Harrelson was the good cop, but you realize now he has all these layers and he's not a good guy. And you've seen McConaughey's character do this, and then them as a team, like that's really interesting. So the why done it really says to this audience, we have all these tools from genre that we can play with, but we're going to get really deep on an individual human being and go inside their brains and try and really understand what makes a human being tick. And so that justified for me wanting to treat the audience as sophisticated. This idea that they would bring to her story all of their knowledge of this genre, but it also neatly mapped in that kind of depending on how you played it, her story could be any one of those three narrative types. Like if you played it in a certain order, it could be a mystery that at the very end the pieces came together. It could be this mystery where you kind of pretty early on realize this character did the murder, but then like how, what are the specifications of that? Or it could be this thing where you're like, okay, I know who did it, and I know, but now I want to know why. Like, what is going on in this woman's life? And that is literally the title of the game, Her Story, right? It's like all of this backstory that is very gothic and fun leads up to that. So that kind of fluidity, this idea that you're working with this toolkit of genre, that the modern audience deals with complexity on a whole different scale. There's a book, what's it called? I think it's called Everything Bad is Good for You, or Everything They Say is Bad is Good for You. And the thesis of that book is everybody thinks that the modern audience is dumbed down, that we play video games instead of watching Shakespeare. But what they do is they compare like with like, right? And they go, yes, we're watching Kardashians and reality shows, but that is our version of the quiz show, right? In 1950, if people wanted some dumb reality entertainment, they would watch a quiz show in which vicariously they're seeing someone win $1 million or lose $1 million. And it's really dumb. Whereas the Kardashians is much more about emotional intelligence and empathy, and there's a lot more going on there. And then you compare cop show with cop show, and you look at Z Cars, where there's one story, the bad guy is 100% a bad guy, and the story goes A, B, C, end. Compare that with The Wire, or even something like NCIS is going to have multiple threads running through it. They're going to twist who the bad guy actually is. You might have a meta narrative of the detectives. Like, just the level of sophistication is so much greater. Like, my kids now, have seen so many episodes of television, read so many comic books, played so many video games, just absorbed so much stuff, versus, the average person in 1950 how many movies had they seen, how many books had they read. You know, we just have this kind of this toolkit, like I say, that for me is super exciting as an interactive storyteller, and it's terrifying to a linear storyteller, because the linear storyteller who wants to do a cop show now, like what twist is he going to pull up? You know, what is he going to do that's going to surprise people that have seen everything? It's terrifying. Whereas for me, I'm like, well, this is cool because I have this audience that brings all this to the table, and now we can play with it and we can kind of tell the story together.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I mean, that was like 5 to 6 questions answered. So thank you. I want to move for a moment to a more operational level, to a mechanical level, because your games, Her Story and Telling Lies, can be described as interface games. I think that will be a good way to describe how they work and how every nook and cranny is connected. And you have the player performing very, very common activities, everyday activities through all computers and operation systems and mother computers and video chats and what have you. It may seem that there's not difficulty there. Definitely, there's not traditional difficulty in that performance. But what we want to get to is how this idea of swapping ability related difficulty for narrative complexity difficulties, if that makes sense, has to do with moving to a more general audience. If you think that your games being interface games makes them more attractive to casual gamers, casual players.
Yeah, no, I think there's several things, right? I think there's something neat about taking an activity that is familiar, that maybe even to the level of like being a reflex activity, and using that to tell your story. But even like going back to like the Silent Hill games, when we did Shattered Memories, I started to formulate this idea that you know, when a player sits down to play your game, they need to know what on earth they're doing, right? And to some extent, that's why video game genres are mechanical. Because if I'm going to play a first-person shooter, I know what is expected of me. I need to point at things and pull a trigger, and I know which buttons will usually be the trigger button. So if you're going to deviate from that, you need to very quickly figure out like how do they know what they're doing. So with Shattered Memories, we had a lot of thought into, like, we had the Wiimote and stuff. So we had this flashlight that you held in your hand, and then we'd put you in dark rooms, and so it made sense that you just very intuitively pointed this thing, and that became kind of your eyes, because to see something in a dark room, you need to point a torch at it. So it became this mechanic that allowed players to express, I want to look at that thing, I'm interested in this. So I think if you're asking a lot of the player, so, you know, in the case of Her Story, where I am trying to be opaque, where I am trying to be provocative and say to them, like, you know, I'm not going to tell you what to do, you can't also have them confused about how to go about doing anything, right? So the familiarity then of them getting, oh, this is a search box, it kind of works like Google. That is important. I think with Telling Lies, we did some things where the way the video player works there is not the way a YouTube video player works, right? But we wanted to create the mindset of a surveillance job. We wanted to create the feel of spying on people, and so we knew that there's like a visual of that, similar to even like with Her Story, that we fixated on this idea that, like, we have seen cop shows where, and in fact, I think True Detective, the final mystery was solved because someone's just sat looking at a computer database, right? There is a beat in a lot of cop narratives where they're just searching searching to find a suspect in a database, or they go to the library and they're looking through the microfiche of old newspapers until they find the one clue, right? So we totally get that beat, and we understand emotionally how it feels. So in her story, if you search for a bunch of things and get nothing back, you don't feel like you're failing the game. Emotionally, that's that beat. You stay up till 2 a.m. looking through this database until you get the one aha moment, right? That's what happens in True Detective. So you have this understanding of that element that we're replicating with the interface. And similarly with Telling Lies, we've seen people go through surveillance tapes, rewind them and fast forward. We've seen if I'm surveilling somebody, I'm going to sit in a car and sit and watch them for hours, and nothing interesting will happen until the one moment when I see somebody cross the window or say something, or I overhear something. So we wanted to try and replicate that mechanically by having people manually have to scrub through the video, by having these video clips be longer, by having you dropped in at different moments, because we wanted to replicate this. Like the example I would give is like if you're a butler spying through the keyhole, right? If you have that kind of sense of spying on somebody, you don't have a perfect framing on the scene. You don't see what's going on inside there until it crosses in front of the keyhole. So that kind of lack of context was important. So that was where the idea of dropping you into the middle of a scene would come from. So you would just be dropped into a piece of narrative. You would only have half of the narrative in the case of Telling Lies. So you would have that kind of disconnect. So I think it's always really important to me that the kind of mechanical elements are obvious, either because we're replicating something specific like Google search, or because like emotionally and just atmospherically almost like we've seen this moment before and we're kind of expanding that moment. But I think it's the interesting thing for me with the interface games is I think I was conscious when I made Her Story that I didn't want the audience to think that this was a cheap way to make a game. I didn't want them to think, oh, he's made this game look like Windows 3.1 because that's cheap graphics. So I put this extra element of extra polish into the visuals with some of the post-processing, with the reflection in the screen, with some of the sound design, to really kind of bed you into that and still have the kind of feedback and the polish and the kind of game feel that you might get in a normal game. So I think those are kind of important elements there.